Good morning and a very warm welcome to Net Zero Week, the UK's official National Awareness Week and the biggest online net zero conference in the country. Many thanks to our sponsors for this week, who are Beyondly, Hitachi Zero Carbon, Manpower, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Ramboll. Many thanks for their support for this week. My name is Andy Walker. I'm a freelance construction journalist and also a contributor to Climate Perspectives magazine, which I would urge everybody to go and look at online for all the latest developments in the world of net zero and climate. We have three themed conference days during Net Zero Week. Today we'll be looking and focusing on business and industry. Tomorrow we'll look at energy economy, and on Wednesday we'll be looking at places, a very important part of the whole net zero and sustainability journey. During all of our sessions, the audience, that's yourselves out there, will have the opportunity to ask questions or make brief points using the questions box that you will see in front of you on the screen, depending on the type of device that you're using to access the webinar this morning. So please do make use of that. Anyway, I think that's about enough in terms of housekeeping from me. Let's get started with our first session. And that first session, as you will be aware, is on the issue of net zero solutions, integrating circular economy and building decarbonisation for inclusive transition. We've got a great panel to help us discuss the key issues involved in all of that, because as we know, achieving the UK's net zero obligations requires a comprehensive and inclusive approach. We've got three industry leaders to discuss this issue. We have Chris Smith, lead consultant for Resource Efficiency and Circularity at Beyondly, and he'll be talking about the importance of a circular economy in tackling emissions from material consumption alongside energy efficiency, amongst other things. We have Lora Brill, Head of Sustainability for Buildings at UK, Head of Sustainability for Buildings UK at Ramboll, and she'll be exploring some of the methods to decarbonise existing existing buildings and new buildings, focusing on reducing operational and embodied carbon. And we've also got Mike Foster, who's the Chief Executive of the Energy and Utilities Alliance, and he'll be highlighting the need for inclusive decarbonisation in business and industry, with a focus on the roles of gas networks and industrial clusters. Our first speaker in this session is Chris Smith, who is lead consultant, as I said, of Resource Efficiency and Circularity at Beyondly. And Beyondly are one of the sponsors of Net Zero Week. So thanks again to them and to Chris for their support. Chris is passionate about turning waste into resources and creating networks and systems that enable resource efficiency and also closing gaps towards a more circular resource economy. He works with many organisations in the manufacturing and service sector in the UK and overseas, with a particular focus on practical solutions based on data and evidence-based decision making. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andy. And thanks to Andy and Shaw and the team at Net Zero Week for hosting Beyondly today. My focus really is to emphasise the importance of that resource-efficient, circular approach to tackling emissions from production and material consumption. So it's alongside renewables and energy efficiency. A circular economy, of course, takes a whole systems approach that tackles global challenges of climate change, biodiversity loss, waste and pollution together. So far, tackling climate change has focused really on renewable energy and efficiency in energy systems, but we cannot miss the opportunity to accelerate climate action by embracing these key areas as part of the same system. And they really are. So we've got resource efficiency, which is, at simplest terms, doing the same with more or more with less. So essentially managing our economy with less intensive resource use. So that can be thinking about zero food waste to landfill, avoidable plastic waste, avoidable waste entirely, minimal landfill generation. And circular economy is the second part, so that's designing systems to eliminate that waste and pollution, keeping products and materials in the economy at their highest value, i.e. keeping the value there, and regenerate nature. So that's sort of designing systems for circular economy, looking at creating products, services and processes that prioritize that resource efficient waste minimization or avoidance and that continual use of materials. So some examples might be product design for longevity or modularity, and that can be in anything that we would consume, closed loop manufacturing, product as a service models, resource recovery systems, industrial symbiosis, sustainable packaging, construction and demolition waste recycling, reuse, and agricultural waste utilization. Circular fashion, there are, of course, many more, but some examples there. And finally, of course, net zero approaches, the reason why we're here this week. And in simple terms, that's cutting carbon emissions to a small amount of residual emissions that can be absorbed and durably stored by nature. So why this three-pronged approach? Well, because according to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, energy efficiency and switching to renewable energy will address only 55% of global emissions. To reach net zero, we also need to address the remaining 45% from the stuff that we consume by changing systems of production and consumption across raw materials. So that's manufacturing, construction, and food throughout the value chain. So it's not easy, and there are a few precedents and not many indicators which we can work with. So it is difficult. For the UK, Labour sees environment as core issues to voters. Time will tell if their election promises have that real impact that they've promised. COP28 finally recognised the role of resource efficiency and circular economy by driving sustainable consumption and production initiatives. Also recognised in the Global Stocktake Report, so a declaration on sustainable agriculture, resilient food systems and climate action, supported by 158 countries. So action will happen there. But to summarise, our collective challenge is to agree and implement these UK and global commitments and translate to local actions urgently and at scale. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed, Chris, for those opening comments. We'll come back to you in the Q&A, I'm sure. Our next speaker is Lora Brill, who's Head of Sustainability for Buildings UK for Ramboll, who are also a sponsor of Net Zero Week. So thanks very much to them for their support. Lora leads the sustainability services for Ramboll buildings in the UK and I believe Ireland as well, implementing their global sustainability strategy and commitments such as Steel Zero and Concrete Zero. She's got significant experience working with organisations over 2 decades, it says in my notes here, to advance their sustainability journey in the built environment. And those organisations range from global corporations, FTSE 250 property companies, investment management houses, government and local community groups. So we're in the hands of someone who knows what they're talking about, as is the case with all of our speakers today and at the rest of Net Zero Week. So Lora, it's over to you.
Andy, thanks for that very warm introduction, much appreciated, and also for all the work that's gone into this really important week by you and the team. I think, so Chris's comments link really well to my own, although he's sort of focused on a economy-wide resource efficiency. My focus really is the built environment, so buildings specifically. And I like to think about it with sort of a 3-principle structure. The first is to retain and enhance. So much of our property life cycle approach has been about a 20-year lifetime, knock it down, start over. That's what creates the most value for investment holders. But we really need to change that and to keep more of the buildings that we have. And rather than knocking them down, as our tastes change and our economies and demographic trends change, we adjust the existing buildings that we have to suit the way that we live and work today. I think it's really important to reimagine buildings as valuable structures and material banks, which links right into circular economy. And one of the things I'll be really interested to see with the speech that Rachel Reeves is doing today in terms of reforms to the planning regulations in this country is whether we're going to get policy that backs that up across the country, because it's been in quite isolated spots to date, and regulation would really help to push that forward. So the next principle I think is really important is lean and clean. So that means clean materials that have limited chemicals in them that are harmful to us or to other living creatures in the ecosystem, many of which we rely upon for our own materials and well-being. And then lean design that doesn't over specify. So we have a history of specifying to a very robust standard without necessarily questioning whether that's actually what a building requires. And also, because of the highly technical and detailed nature of redoing drawings, it can be hard. It has been historically hard to pivot mid-project when you think, oh, actually, let's challenge that. Let's think about maybe doing it differently. But we have a real advantage now because we have digital tools that allow us to quickly assess thousands of different design options, whether that be from an operational or a structural perspective, to find the ones that fit, that are sort of in the sweet spot, and also to have confidence that we have found the best set of options. And because of that digital speed that we now have, we can take a different approach to design, and that's something that we see happening throughout the industry, and we think it's a really important change. And then enduring appeal. So part of what makes it possible to retain buildings into the future is making them beautiful. And I think that's something that can sometimes get lost in the conversations around energy efficiency. If you put up a really ugly block of flats versus a beautiful block of flats, A, the experience of living in them is going to be different, but B, the likelihood that they will be retained for 100 years is much higher for the beautiful block of flats. And that really supports the circular economy of the future. So if we're using part of our carbon budget today to invest in building something, we should be using it wisely. We should be using it on something that is going to be, the speed fashion of the future for buildings and going to get thrown away. So you actually mentioned, Andy, that Concrete Zero and Steel Zero are some of the commitments that we've made as a company, but I just wanted to flag those because I think they're really important across all of the built environment as well, including infrastructure, energy. Cement is approximately 8% of global emissions, and that's about triple aviation emissions. Steel, likewise, is responsible for about 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And they are both critical substances that we use across many, many aspects of industry. And having a proper decarbonization strategy, both in how we specify, but and also how we produce those, is really critical to economy-wide decarbonization. And again, I'm really interested to see how government looks to support that.
Great, thanks very much indeed for that, Laura. I'm sure we'll come back on some of those points in the Q&A as well. I've just noticed there's a particular question. We always get these on these occasions where our panel are being asked what they have done personally to undertake decarbonisation in their own lives. So you might want to start thinking about your answer to that question, because I, for one, are very interested in that anyway. If only just to gather ideas for my own decarbonisation drive at home as well. But thanks for the moment, Laura, for that contribution. The next speaker in the session is Mike Foster, who's the Chief Executive of the Energy and Utilities Alliance, which is a not-for-profit trade association based in the West Midlands. Mike started his work having started work in the car industry, Mike taught accountancy, economics and statistics for 6 years before becoming MP for Worcester. It says here. Is that right, Mike? MP for Worcester?
That's
it
correct,
is
Andy,
indeed. And he served as a minister, no less, for 4 years under both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. So he's probably still recovering from sleep deprivation after watching the television or the various multiple channels that we can watch television these days on Thursday night. As I say, he served as a minister in both the Tony Blair and under Gordon Brown, latterly as Minister for International Development. And before heading up the Energy and Utilities Alliance, Mike was head of communications at the international charity WaterAid, an excellent organisation that do some fantastic work internationally. Mike, over to you.
Look, thanks, Andy. Thanks very much for the introduction, and I do apologise if there's still a bit of a smile on my face from last week. Look, and I think, yeah, thanks to you and your team for putting on this event. And just to follow on from what both Laura and Chris have said, they very much spoke about whole systems and that thinking that needs to go into, really, really concentrating the minds of how we decarbonise properly. And to chuck in my 2 penneth worth into the debate, we've found that at the moment the discussion and the arguments around net zero and decarbonising the energy system have tended to focus on the relative efficiency of a heat pump versus that of a boiler. And whilst that's important, it should not be the sole determinant of how we actually design a net zero whole energy system. So that's the first thing. The second point I'd like to make is that decarbonisation should not mean deindustrialisation. The UK has been broadly successful so far in reducing its greenhouse gas emissions, but fundamentally that has been achieved by switching from coal to gas and renewables in our power generation, and it has also been as a result of some deindustrialisation in heavy industry. And we can't necessarily allow that to continue without thinking through the consequences for communities up and down the land. And that leads me to my third point, is that a just transition to net zero must mean that no consumer and no community gets left behind, because that would not be a just transition by definition. And how we treat industry and business is as important as how we treat people's homes, in how we get on and succeed in our thinking. So we need to take into account the views of local people, of business leaders, so that when politicians are making these decisions, then they're actually recognizing that a just transition is key to it all. And I can say this coming on the back of a general election in the UK and parliamentary elections in France yesterday, that I believe failure to take notice of this will risk consumers, when they see, when they take on the role as voters, actually turning to the politics of those who are far more net zero skeptic. And that is something, Andy, frankly, that our planet can't afford to do. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. I'm glad you finished off on that point, because, and also you mentioned the events in France overnight, because one of the things that's gone unreported in that, and possibly even in the UK political scene as well, is the amount of support for, shall I say, greener parties, both with a capital G and a lowercase g. And I think that's something that we all need to take notice of, because this stuff is actually electorally popular. I know that's not the only consideration. We should be doing it because it's the right thing to do, but I think people should recognise that, and our politicians should recognise that as well. Anyway, that's my little bit of soapbox done for now. I might well jump on it again later, but anyway, let's move into some questions. I just want to go back to Chris and ask you a question, Chris. Given the fact that the world's material consumption contributes around 45% of global greenhouse gas emissions, what can we do to raise awareness and increase the resilience of our economies and drive action towards a resource efficient circular economy?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, the government is trying. We've got the circular economy package, we've got these targets. I mean, I wouldn't say they're generally in the public knowledge. It's one of those things, if you're in the industry, you might know about it. And we now have interim targets around this, so that will filter through to local authorities and the consumer to make those efforts. I think pollution and regeneration are mentioned in our the resource and waste strategy again, but the opportunity to kind of address those shared goals of net zero and circular economy are kind of been missed, really. So there's not an awful lot of push from the government to kind of encourage that through business in some areas there. And we don't have targets around things like reducing, reusing. Recycling has been the focus, and I think as a consumer, we do need to kind of think about trying to push things up that waste hierarchy back to kind of reduce, reuse. and repair. So I think there isn't really a strong message around that. And if you look at other nations as well, in terms of things like producer responsibility for packaging and helping citizens to recycle more, we don't really have an awful lot of funding, and there's no real at the moment there's no plans to kind of really have a big consumer push to kind of help that sort of education and awareness. But it comes down to those sort of daily activities and initiatives that we can do. And from a business point of view, there are some good initiatives around there. So I think there are opportunities to do that. And, we've got things like the Keynote commitment, which is about looking at food waste, reducing that by 50% by 2030. So there's some good initiatives around there, and that is filtering through to kind of food manufacturing systems as well. So it's not just the consumers.
Thanks, Chris. Just turning to Lora, I was interested in what you said about viewing buildings as kind of resources and repositories, something that we can actually, do something with. How do we create a national existing buildings materials inventory, a database that supports a circular economy in the building sector, in your view?
It's a really interesting question, Andy, and it's one that there's definitely been attempts to grapple with from an SME perspective and from industry, sort of architects, engineers, owners. So there are some existing material exchange banks. So Excess Material Exchange just launched earlier this year, actually. There's some local and national material exchange places, and there are sort of smaller, more local organizations. And there's I shouldn't say quite a bit, but there is some within buildings that are owned by the same owner or organization, sort of thinking about donor to recipient buildings. So, okay, I'm retrofitting this building. What can I give to another building that I'm also planning to retrofit? But that's still quite limited. It doesn't get us to the scale that we need to get to. So I think what we need to get, so and part of the barrier is lack of information. So if you don't know what's in the building, it's actually very difficult to identify the materials that can be harvested. So I think there needs to be a long-term strategic plan around it. But in the short term, what I think could be done, and done quickly, is to set up a national database where consultants can actually record which buildings they've got drawings available for, so that building owners can get access to that detailed building information in order to harvest materials. There's some early conversations going on that, but I think that could quickly push this forward. And from a more sort of ambitious perspective, I think government could have a place to play here, given the number of vacant buildings that we have, that there could be, for example, a business rates holiday if you map your building and put the materials that are on it onto a national database, particularly if that building isn't going to be used for the purpose for which it was originally conceived or most recently used, and you're planning to retrofit it, or you might actually have to demolish it. If we can incentivize people to take this period of time where it's empty, realize economic value for themselves, and create materials for the circular economy, I think that's a real opportunity, and it's something that could be acted on right now.
Thanks for that, Lora. Just going back to Mike again, your comments on the just transition, I think, and making sure that we don't deindustrialize while we decarbonise, I think, are very germane. And I'm sure there's various interest groups, not the least the trade unions that represent many workers around the country in different sectors, who will echo those comments. But what about kind of the new industries of the future that we want to see built in order to support net zero? What role will industrial clusters, these clusters of different types of industry, what role will they have in the future, in your view?
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, you're right to point out that the trade union movement is clearly going to be interested in making sure that decarbonisation doesn't mean deindustrialisation. And I recently spoke at the Community Trade Union Conference a couple of weeks back in Brighton, where they are grappling with this, at Port Talbot in South Wales, where there are real risks of thousands of job losses on the back of how do we decarbonise steel, and whether we should be carrying on with the steel industry that we have currently. So the role of industrial clusters that's envisaged is that there are going to be key areas across the UK. So the Northwest Corridor, Teesside, possibly around Grangemouth in Scotland, where there are major heavy industries that are going to require large quantities of energy to carry on their business. And they know that they can't carry on burning natural gas to do that. And so the industrial cluster concept is that if you are going to prioritize alternatives, such as hydrogen, you pipe that hydrogen to the industrial clusters as your first priority. So you can generate your hydrogen, use it there so that we don't lose these industries. So Pilkington Glass in the Northwest, for instance, huge user of energy. It can't do it any other way than using molecules to be burnt for heat, and therefore to be compatible with net zero, you've got to have an alternative form of gas, and that the only one that the world is basically talking about is hydrogen in potentially sufficient quantities. And those industrial clusters will be essential to keep those industries in situ, because if you don't have that cluster, you don't have it provided with the piped hydrogen that can be generated locally, so it's good for jobs all round, then frankly you'll see the end of those industries with all the consequences that you will have upon those local communities.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to pick on some questions from the chat because we've got loads, and I don't want to. Inevitably, won't get through to them all, but I think there's some that I just want to ask about, particularly ones that are kind of hyper topical, given the change of government in the UK and that various announcements being made. So there's one from Daniel in the chat where he says there's some data that suggests new build houses are only built to last between 40 and 60 years, with the new government promising to accelerate house building. How do you think that will be tackled from the point of view of making them more sustainable? And I'll kick off with Laura on that one, if I may, and then I'll turn to Chris. So, Laura, what's your view on that?
Well, I mean, the obvious thing to do is actually to require a minimum life target for the housing build as part of the planning process. So if that, and I think it's an interesting one. It's one that we see our sort of more ambitious clients looking at, sort of extending the expected lifetime to 100, 120 years as they look at the sort of the quality and the criteria of the design. So I think also if we look around, we can see a lot of houses that were probably not intended to survive for 70, 80, 100 years that are now creeping up to that. So whatever the initially intended lifespan is not always the lifespan. And particularly with housing, it often ends up staying around. So it has to be of good quality when it's first built, because it will almost certainly stay. It's different from commercial housing, from commercial buildings, which can go in and out much more quickly. Housing, once built, tends to remain in use.
Thanks, Laura. Kind of linked to that as well, and feel free to address the housing issue if you wish, Chris, but I think there's something here around regulatory issues as well, and what the government's going to put in place going forward from the point of view of how it wants to see its kind of net zero policy develop. How well, in your view, is the UK positioned from that regulatory and industrial perspective to consider some of the issues we've been talking about here: resource efficiency, circular economy, and net zero approaches in the round all together? By keeping materials circulating, that joined up approach, because obviously the government in its election manifesto, or opposition as was, talked about this, growth, but what kind of growth? I'm not sure there's a great deal of flesh on those bones. So how can we ensure that we advocate for that joined up approach that we really need in this area?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. And it sort of ties in well with what Laura was saying. The UK does have its clean growth strategy, so that's a fairly sort of broad-reaching strategy, focusing on sort of decarbonising all sectors of the UK economy and promoting that kind of clean growth. So I think that's pretty integral to achieving net zero, by 2050, which is obviously the long-term goal. I'm not fully up to speed with progress kind of along those lines. I don't know if any of the panel or you, Andy, have got thoughts on that. I mean, from a sort of materials and resources strategy, we've got that resource and waste strategy. It is being updated, so it's not just sort of fixed in 2018 when it was first created. So there are evolutions to that and improvements to that, and it is getting sort of the targets are becoming more, more realistic, more achievable. We've got our net zero by 2050 commitment. We've got other things as well. Packaging, extended producer responsibility. That are coming in for textiles hopefully soon as well. And in theory, a country should have producer responsibility for everything that is consumed. And perhaps that could extend to the building life cycle as well. But I think also from a building point of view, construction, interesting to look at that life cycle of a construction, the overall from raw materials through use phase through end of life as well. And I think some studies around that they are existing. Perhaps I think it's a fairly early study. Laura, again, happy to hear your thoughts on that. But I think that's a really good way to look at it. And if you do consider that full life cycle impact as well as the benefits, then you can kind of really appraise how well something is performing and what can be done to kind of improve it and keep it in the economy.
Thanks, Chris. I mean, as important as though the housing issue is, and it is very important, clearly, business and industry, we're not going to get to net zero without basically dealing with that particular sector. And just turning back to you, Mike, for a moment, sometimes it can be seen that there might be a conflict between some of the emissions that are coming out of business and industry, even through the transition, and communities' interest. We often see local communities opposing developments that might actually be beneficial for short-term reasons. I mean, in your view, how will and how should local communities and their elected representatives, bear in mind that you were once one of them, how should they respond to the challenges of the emissions in the business and industrial sector?
I mean, it's going to be really interesting, Andy, to see how the newly elected politicians covering whole swathes of areas that perhaps had opposed, let's say, new transmission lines for an updated power grid, how they are going to cope with the challenge of, on the one hand, seeing that as the right thing to do to get to net zero, set against local objections based on current sort of planning rules that can be used to prevent development, be it power pylons or be it housing developments or industrial developments. It's going to be a real challenge because the clock is ticking, and if we don't decarbonize the power sector, we will never ever get to net zero. So it's got to be at the front line of how we do it. So it's going to require a degree of compromise, but that is going to be really hard in a political system that basically thrives on confrontation. It likes to set one up against another, and getting a common view or a third way, if you like, is always difficult, and particularly for newly elected politicians who are still finding their feet. And we literally don't have time to sort of allow a debate to go on for 3 or 4 years, because the new government have got a 2030 target to decarbonise power. The old government had 2035. Both of those are incredibly ambitious target dates to be met, and they will not stand a delay of 2 or 3 years whilst people become educated in the whys and the wheres and around power decarbonisation. But that's the first port of call. That'll be the first battle, and it'll be on that east coast of England where we see the challenges. We've seen them already, and I think those challenges will just get louder because politics will start to play into the debate, as well as around the practicalities of, how do you mask a pylon? Can you go underground? What's the cost of going underground? Because it's probably prohibitive to underground all these transmission cables. And then it's around, have we got the supply chain available to actually deliver it? So there's lots of debates around that, and it's going to be really hard because those newly elected politicians, they might be sitting on quite small majorities, and
in rural areas.
Exactly, they'll be looking at what might happen in 4 or 5 years' time, and that will obviously prey upon their thinking, and that's something that government needs to help them address at the same time as they need to be the voice of their local communities.
I think that's true, but I also think it's a really great opportunity for our sector to help government as well. I know traditionally a lot of business sectors don't want to get too involved in politics, but unfortunately on this issue, like so many, I think there is definitely a political dimension, but one which our industry as a whole, if we look at it in that way, I suppose the infrastructure, the engineering, the power sector can actually help government achieve its aims in this particular area, because there's no doubt that it's a big challenge. And someone's put a question in the chat: how do we get rural communities on board with the construction of green energy projects like solar farms and wind farms when those communities have traditionally been very resistant to development in their areas? I mean, I think some of those projects look, actually, to use the phrase that Laura used earlier in a different context, they look beautiful. But then it's easy for me to say because I don't live next to one, and I often only see them when I'm driving down the M1. However, I think that's a real issue, and I think one which the new government will have to grapple with, but ultimately you'll have to grapple with it with the support of the industry, with the support of organisations like Laura's, who actually do the work in that area. So again, putting you kind of on the spot, Laura, how do we actually get people to support, embrace those kind of developments when maybe in the past they've actually opposed them? I mean, is it possible, and how do we do it? A big question there, and it's not a job interview question to become a government advisor. But anyway, give it a go.
You're harking back to my past in public policy, Andy.
There you are then.
Deeply buried, but there you go. So I think the key is, I don't think it's easy. I think Mike has absolutely been spot on around the conflicts and the counter incentives here. But I think the key is to understand if there is something beneficial that can be delivered for the communities that feel like they will be negatively impacted. I mean, one of the things that's come up over and over again from the agricultural community in this country is that land is being the sense that land is being converted from farming to environmental uses, and that is actually degrading the ability to make a living from farming. So I think you have to address that issue and ensure that we are properly supporting farmers and have a strategy for agriculture in the long term that people can believe in and that really feels like it's going to benefit them. And that's the only way that you unlock that, because if you are going to be taking land for one use off of another use, it has to be a net positive for those who see that as affecting their economic way of life. I think from the beauty point of view, we can and should do a better job at designing infrastructure to be beautiful and not just utilitarian. And I think that's a challenge that we have to embrace. I mean, we've spent a lot of years undergrounding, utility lines. And so a lot of us have gotten used to, over the last 40 years, views without utility lines obscuring them. In various places, we've resurfaced rivers that have been underground, that were previously undergrounded. So I think we need to learn from those experiences of the past where decisions were made for utilitarian purposes to change an aspect of beauty, and then we've reversed them. we really need to think about, okay, what can we learn from that to make this a more beautiful approach? And I'm not claiming to be that person. I'm the first person who will say I'm not graphically oriented and will always seek the help of a colleague to make a presentation look beautiful. But I think that, we need to sort of embrace a new generation of architects and infrastructure designers away from looking at iconic buildings and towards looking at beautiful infrastructure.
Thanks, Laura. I mean, I want to, before we close, and we've got about 10 minutes left, I want to turn to planning in a second, because I think that's going to be crucial in all of this. But I just want to ask Chris as well, the title of this session is about integrating the circular economy. Is that well enough understood amongst the concept of a circular economy? Is it well enough understood amongst the population out there? And how do we actually use that to, I suppose, go on this journey of persuasion at a rapid pace as well of the public for what's actually needed? Because a couple of people put in the chats, we just need to get on and do it. The time for debate is over and all the rest of it. So I just wonder, how do we fast track that approach while making it clear about the benefits of having that kind of circular economy approach?
It's a great question and covers lots of sort of different themes that that cities, consumers, and businesses are all grappling with, really. I think, if you think about cities, only 10% are sort of embarking on their circular economy approach, and that's a really difficult thing. And if you think about what 65-70%, we're increasingly an urban population, globally, and particularly in Europe, which I think, it's about 65% of people live in urban areas. So if we can encourage circularity, resource efficiency in urban areas, and we get that three-way benefit, net zero, as well as the resource side of it too. We're currently working on a project, it's EU Horizon funded, 5.5 million over 3 years, to help cities be more circular more often and with more success. And I think they find that sort of city employees are asked to be involved in circularity projects, but they're not CE experts. So the difficulty really is throughout, city organisations. In terms of people, circular economy, it's a little bit abstract. I think with say carbon and energy, we can put a number on it. There are tangible, quantifiable goals that we can kind of think about and measure. With circular economy, that's very difficult because there's so many indicators. There are hundreds of indicator sets, and these are increasing, unfortunately. Part of the goal of this project is to kind of rationalize that into a set of circular economy indicators, which essentially, how are we doing? How are we progressing? So that's a difficult thing. So I think absolutely, if cities are struggling and sort of city organisations are struggling, then as consumers, it's very difficult. So I think we really need to make it very simple. So for a consumer, if you've got a role, and that's maybe something like to encourage reuse, let's try and make that simple. Make the message simple. Don't ask too much of a consumer, in terms of what their activity might be. And in terms of businesses, I think there are, lots of good initiatives out there. Certainly cities will be looking to procure from those businesses that can demonstrate that they have a circularity agenda and they have, sustainability practices. So I think it will filter through, but I think it's going to take a lot of collaboration and a lot of hard work, and, really that system thinking, which is difficult because that's the part where things get complicated, and there's no kind of easy fit calculation for circular economy, unfortunately, but I think we're getting there.
Thanks, Chris. I just want to turn to you, Mike, and unfortunately I'm going to have to draw on some of your previous experience in the political sector. I mean, there's no doubt that planning is going to be central to a lot of what needs to be done going forward. And just as in this session we've been talking about a holistic approach to the whole issue, surely, when these, the government announce its planning plans, if you like, going forward, it's not just going to say, it kind of, just do it. This is what we have to have. Surely it's going to link up the benefits of why we have to be quicker with the need to be quicker as well. Otherwise, there's a risk of a backlash. But how do we ensure? How do you think the government should operate in this area going forward? Because clearly it needs to speed up. But how does it take people with it on that speeded up journey? I think that's what I'm interested in.
Look, I think Laura answered that, Andy, in what she said about demonstrating the benefits of of the change, and I give you an example of that thinking. When I was a politician, I remember in my constituency, large protest groups set up opposing a mobile phone mast at the top of their road. Now, the arguments about why aren't I getting a signal in my home because of a lack of phone masts being available? Because at the time, nobody really demonstrated properly what the value was of this change, of this infrastructure being put, close to people's homes. And the scare stories were allowed to develop, and it delayed the infrastructure being put in place. But now everybody gets that benefit because they can get their 4 and 5G, and they've got their signal. Whereas if you go to areas that lack a mobile phone signal, I mean, that's what gets people angry when they can't, make a call, or they can't download whatever they need to. So it's demonstrating the benefit and the value of the change. In this case, planning, but it could be about infrastructure being put close to local communities. That's the secret, and they have to be better at it. So, top of my head, if you were looking at building new houses on a greyfield area, it would be look at the jobs that would be created locally, because construction is typically where you get local created jobs. It would be look what might happen to getting people onto the housing ladder for local families. It would be about, it might play a role in bringing down rents for those that were renting locally. So there's three big benefits there for local communities that can be sold, the idea, provided you've got people willing to spend the time and effort to make that case.
Thanks, Mike. I think you've highlighted and answered a question that was in the chat as well about the role of communications in all of this, and it's something that I'm really keen that the new government actually gets on the front foot about as well. It's not just enough to say, we need to do this. I think the because is very important, and I think that needs to be an holistic approach across the board. We've almost run out of time, but I just want to ask you all a very quick fire round question, so it doesn't have to be very long. In fact, it can't be, because we've only got a few minutes left, and it goes back to one of the very first questions that was posted in the chat from Julian, and he said, can he ask each of the panel what they've personally done or undertaken to reduce their CO2 emissions in the recent period. So I'm just going to go round the room very, very quickly and start with you, Chris, first, then Mike, and then I'll finish with Laura. So Chris, very quickly and briefly.
Okay, I compost at home, and that's going pretty well. I try and put as much green waste as I can back on the soil, and I've taken everything from a broken garden chair to my favourite jeans to two great ladies in my local market who are fantastic at repairing. So I think I try and repair as much as I can, and I thank my dad for that, because he was a great repairer. So yeah.
Thanks very much. I can relate to the dad issue there. Mike.
In my voluntary time, I'm chair of Affordable Warmth Solutions, which deals with bringing warmth to the fuel poor, and that was also included giving the financial go-ahead, distributing £160 million. So we've given the go-ahead for 12,000 heat pumps, for instance, to be fitted across UK homes. In my own home, we've been improving the energy efficiency of the building, which we think is the obvious thing to do. And also, I have to say, I have been replanting an old Worcestershire fruit orchard, and still going through that process.
Thanks very much, Mike. Laura.
I joined a co-housing community in Cambridge. My family and I were part of the process of designing it, and moved in as some of the original living members. Live in an all-electric house as a result, with an air source heat pump, and we have a smaller footprint in our house, and we share more of the facilities with our neighbors, rather than having everything just to ourselves and replicated across every house. So reducing the overall emissions from living.
Fantastic. And actually, I'm really glad to hear all of that. No surprise to me at all, because it always strikes me that people who work in this sector are very committed to the issue. as well. And I think that's really important. And hopefully, if we've got similar individuals who are also committed within government, then some of the issues that we've been discussing today will actually get implemented, but importantly, implemented at speed, given the urgency of the situation. As I said, we've now run out of time. I think it's been an excellent discussion, a lot of food for thought, and points that we will inevitably return to in future conversations during the course of this week and beyond. It just falls for me to thank very much our panelists once again, Chris Smith from Beyondly, Lora Brill from Ramboll, and Mike Foster from the Energy and Utilities Alliance. Thank you very much for your insights and for your generous contributions this morning. The next session in Net Zero Week will start in around 10 minutes, and that will be a discussion, a fireside chat with Mike Nugent from Hitachi Zero Carbon. Thanks very much indeed, and enjoy the rest of your day.